It's early 1945. World War II has been raging for more than 5 years. In Europe, Nazi Germany is on the verge of defeat in both the West and the East. And on the other side of the world, the US pushes toward Japan after a long war on both land and at sea. But the war isn't over yet. Millions of people have already been killed, and many more will die before the Allies secure victory. And even after the war ends, the Allies will face big questions about how the post-war world will look. I'm Isabella, and this is the World War II Legacy Electronic Field Trip from the National WWII Museum in New Orleans. I'm joined by my teacher, Mr. Alex Simmons. Today we're exploring the museum to understand the lasting legacy of World War II on all of our lives today. In part one of this electronic field trip, we'll talk about how the war finally ends in an Allied victory. We'll take you to some of our galleries here in the museum and to some of the key places across the world where the history was made. The year 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Many of our World War II veterans, Holocaust survivors, home front workers, and people who witnessed the war have sadly passed away. World War II dramatically changed their lives and also came at a great cost. And although 8 decades have passed, the war still influences our daily lives, from the cell phones you carry in your pocket to international relationships across the globe.
Part 1 of our electronic field trip, which you are watching right now, will highlight how World War II ended both in Europe and the Pacific. Part 2, which will be released on May 8th, the 80th anniversary of VE Day, explores the complicated aftermath of the deadliest war in human history, the beginning of a new global order, and the rising tensions of the Cold War. We're not alone in this quest. Teacher Josie Perry and her student Katie will be sharing reports with us from Germany and France so we can see the sites where the history was made firsthand. We will talk with them soon. Poll questions will pop up on screen throughout both episodes, so be sure to have your devices ready. Let's start with our first question now. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched a huge invasion of France across the English Channel. What was that day called? A. Invasion Day, B. Deliverance Day, C. Liberation Day, or D. D-Day? Submit your choices now.
While you're voting, we're going to begin our exploration here in the museum's Road to Berlin Gallery. And no, your eyes are not deceiving you. It's snowing right now in New Orleans. Or should I say, it's digital snow here in the museum's Battle of the Bulge Gallery. And later, we will be joined by museum's historian, Dr. Bradley Hart. Before we dive into one of the last decisive battles of World War II, let's see the answer to our poll question. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched a huge invasion of France across the English Channel. What was that day called? A. Invasion Day, B. Deliverance Day, C. Liberation Day, or D. D-Day? Mr. Simmons has the answer to your question.
The invasion of France was a critical moment in the war and a real turning point towards Allied victory. And that day was referred to as D-Day, making the answer to our poll question D. But before we get there, it's worth reminding ourselves about how we got there. Let's brush up on some basics. There were 2 sides in World War II. The first side, called the Axis powers, was led by Germany, Italy, and Japan. Italy was led by a man named Benito Mussolini, who called himself a fascist. He took control of the government and the economy and believed it was Italy's destiny to build a new version of the Roman Empire. Germany was led by Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party. Hitler and Nazis believed in German racial superiority and was destined to rule Europe. They also believed Germany was under threat from racial enemies, most notably Jewish people. Over the course of the war, Hitler and Nazis would be responsible for the death of millions of people, including 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Japan was led by Emperor Hirohito and a series of prime ministers. The Japanese believed it was the nation's destiny to conquer and rule Asia. In 1936, the Axis powers all signed an agreement declaring their shared goals. In 1937, Japan invaded China, marking the beginning of its war of expansion in the East. And over the years to come, the 3 Axis powers would sign additional treaties pledging to support one another in the event of war. In 1939, Hitler started World War II in Europe when he invaded Poland to the east. Great Britain and France declared war on Germany in return, but Poland fell quickly. Germany went on to defeat and conquer France, and Hitler began bombing Britain. Then, in summer 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the other side of Poland in the east. The Soviet Union had a leader named Joseph Stalin, who was a brutal communist dictator. At this point, the US still wasn't involved directly in the war. But on December 7, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the US gets into the war. The United States would join the war on the side of the Allied powers, rounding out what would be known as the Big Three, which included Great Britain, the US, and the USSR. The leader of the US was President Franklin Roosevelt. The leader of the Soviet Union was Premier Joseph Stalin, and the leader of Great Britain, the third major ally, was Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Together, these leaders would be called the Big Three because of their key leadership roles in the alliance that will win the war. And in 1942, they gave the alliance a name. They called themselves the United Nations. And we'll see there's organizations of the same name today that's a direct descendant of the wartime alliance. Even though the US and the USSR are on the same side in the war, they have very different systems of government. The United States believed in democracy and individual freedom. The Soviet Union was a communist country that had abolished private property and put all the power in the hands of the state. The US and the Soviet Union did not have a good relationship before 1941, but now they were united by a common threat in their effort to defeat Hitler.
But in the meantime, the Allies still need to win the war. 2.5 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Americans, British, and Canadians landed about 160,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy, France on June 6, 1944. D-Day. It's a really important moment and a turning point in the war. Over the months to come, the Western Allies start pushing across France, and by the end of the year, they've liberated the city of Paris and are all the way to the border of Germany itself. Meanwhile, Stalin's troops were nearing the German border in the east. But that didn't mean that the last months of the war would be easy for the Allies. In December 1944, the German army launched a massive offensive against the Allies in the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, known today as the Battle of the Bulge. Bradley from the museum is here now to tell us more. Bradley, thanks for helping us understand the Battle of the Bulge and the end of the war in Europe.
No problem. Thank you for visiting us here at the National WWII Museum.
What were the German forces trying to accomplish?
So at this point in the war, Germany's been pushed back to its own borders effectively. The Allies are winning the war really on both fronts, but especially in the West. The Germans here really are gambling one last time that they can push the Allies back and ideally, in their minds, capture the important port city of Antwerp. So really this is a last roll of the dice for Hitler and the Nazi high command at this point in the war.
This gallery makes it seem like the winter conditions were terrible during the battle. What was it like in the Ardennes forest in December 1944?
Well, it was terrible. As we can see here, it was snowing, it was frigidly cold, men were digging in, and actually some of the dead were frozen on the ground by the time their bodies were recovered. These were really tough conditions. The Germans actually chose a time when their weather was particularly terrible because they didn't want the Allies to be able to bomb their troops as they advanced. So the battle in the Ardennes forest in December and January of 1944 was one of the most intense in the entire European campaign. By January, the Americans and the British have actually pushed the Germans back and are back to their starting positions, but at a very heavy cost. There's more than 80,000 casualties on the American side, including tens of thousands of dead. There's 23,000 Americans who were actually captured. And the Battle of the Bulge will go down as actually the largest engagement ever fought by the American army, with more than 600,000 men taking part. In the end, an Allied victory, but a very costly one.
While we're talking about the last months of the war in Europe, let's take a question from a school right here in New Orleans.
Hi, I'm Mason.
And I'm Sophie, and we're from Mount Carmel Academy in New Orleans.
And we would like to know, at what point did Germany know they had lost the war?
That's a great question. What do you think, Bradley?
Well, I think after the Battle of the Bulge, there's really no way for the Germans to win the war militarily. There's still some generals in Berlin that hope for a negotiated solution, possibly by negotiating with Dwight Eisenhower, to actually change sides and potentially fight against the Soviets. But there won't be a negotiated end to the war. There's no appetite in Washington, D.C. or in London to negotiate with the Nazis at this stage of the conflict.
The Battle of the Bulge was the last great ground battle on the western front of the war in Europe. The Allies defeated the German attackers and pushed them back. By March of 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River in Germany. As the British and Americans moved east and Soviet forces moved west, they encountered the horrors of the Holocaust in the Nazi camps, liberating the survivors that remained and fully exposing the Nazi crimes to the world. In an effort to end the war, the air offensive across Germany continued with devastating bombings that leveled many cities like Dresden and Cologne. Bradley, tell us what we see here in this gallery.
What we see here is a portrayal of what Germany looks like physically at the end of the war. Most German cities have been bombed heavily by the end of the war and literally lie in ruins. Thousands of people have died in these bombings. On April 16th, the Soviet Red Army actually reaches the outskirts of Berlin, and the final climactic battle in Germany is about to begin.
All this happens in April and May 1945. But something else happens in the US at this exact moment too. Can you tell us what happens?
So on April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt actually dies of a cerebral hemorrhage at his home in Hot Springs, Georgia. Roosevelt had been in poor health for some time, and actually many people didn't believe he would survive to see the end of the war. But tragically, the man who has led the country through the entirety of World War II will not live to see the end of the conflict.
So President Roosevelt doesn't live to see the end of the war, but on May 7, 1945, the Germans finally surrendered to the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower. Let's go to Katie and Mrs. Josie Perry, who are right where the surrender took place in France.
Bonjour from Reims, France, the site of the World War II surrender in Europe 80 years ago. I'm joined with my teacher, Mrs. Perry, and together we're going to explore the Musée de la Reddition, or the Surrender Museum, to understand that fateful day that would end the war in Europe.
Thanks, Katie. Before we explore the museum, let's flash back in time. In April 1945, Soviet troops enter Berlin. The battle for the city is vicious and bloody, but the war is finally coming to an end. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his bunker in the center of the city rather than be captured. In his will, Hitler has appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. Dönitz knew the war was lost and contacted the Supreme Allied Commander in the West, General Dwight Eisenhower, offering to surrender.
Let's go explore the museum.
At this very site, at 2:41 a.m. on May 7th, the surrender took place in secret in this map room, which was the headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. This room has been preserved in time. Joining us today is Sarada Villers, who is a docent here at the Surrender Museum. Ms. Villers, can you tell us about how exactly the surrender happened?
The surrender happened here in this room. It was the headquarters of Eisenhower. He makes the choice to move in February 1945 in order to have his headquarters here, and they were prepared for the unconditional surrender. Well, the surrender happened here at 2:41 a.m. in this room. It was a war room. Eisenhower makes the choice to have the surrender here because it was something very important to show to the people that here where he directed the Second World War, the most secret in Europe, happened in this room. It has to function. We do all the operation here in this, as you can see over there, the map also. And the choice of Reims, it is because there was a communication in good condition. There was a railway station, there was an airport also. We are witness of history, what happened here in 1945. The General Yodel came at 2:41 in this room that you can see, and there was the Allied all around in order to have the surrender signed at 2:41. It was a glorious day because this made the end of the Third Reich in Europe.
Can you explain a bit more about what exactly is an unconditional surrender?
Well, the unconditional surrender is mean when Jodl came here, he was placed over there to sign the documentary. He must stop all the war in the 48 hours that he signed the unconditional surrender, that they all stop all the war as the documentary was signed. That's an unconditional surrender.
Thank you so much, Ms. Villers, for sharing this amazing room with us today.
I was happy to welcome you in our surrender room here today. Thank you also.
So this would really be the end of the whole war in Europe all at one time?
Exactly. This is such a big deal that they had to sign not just one, but 2 surrender documents to make this happen. One of them was signed right here in Reims. To see where the second is signed, we would actually have to go into Germany itself. It's about a 10-hour drive. So let's start heading that way. And in the meantime, you have some time to think about that poll question. True or false, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, is celebrated on different dates in different countries. Now is your chance to vote, and we will reveal the answer shortly. We're now in Germany's capital city of Berlin, where we will continue our reporting for this electronic field trip. Let's reveal the answer to the poll question. What do you think, Katie?
False. We were just at the Surrender Museum in France, and I know VE Day is celebrated on the 8th.
Actually, it's true. The Western Allies, like the US, Britain, and France, marked VE Day as the 8th. But there was a second surrender that happened right here in Berlin. Because of the time of the day when it was signed, it was already the 9th in Moscow, so the Soviet Union celebrated the end of the war on the 9th. And Russia still today does that. This second surrender only included a few minor word changes and an additional statement about the German leaders following the commands of the Supreme Command of the Expeditionary Allied Forces and the Supreme High Command of the Red Army.
So, if only a few words were changed, why have a second surrender?
Well, the Soviets felt like their people had suffered so much on the Eastern Front that they were owed their own surrender and that Germany should pay for starting the war. So the Soviets insisted on getting their own surrender signed right here in Berlin. The Soviets wanted to punish Germany for starting the war and inflicting terrible damage across Europe, but the other allies thought they should work together to prevent a future war from happening. This big disagreement sets the stage for the tensions that arose between the Allies in the post-war period. But for now, the war in Europe was finally over. People all over celebrated VE Day, no matter what day they actually celebrated it on. But remember, there was another war going on too, the war in the Pacific. Now the Allies have to decide how to win the war in the Pacific and start making plans for the post-war world.
Now, we're going to continue our journey today to Potsdam, a small city near Berlin where Allied leaders gathered in the summer of 1945 to discuss the ongoing conflict with Japan and begin to lay out their plans for a post-war world. Let's go! We're here inside the Titilienhof Palace site of the Potsdam Conference, one of the most important conferences of the war that took place here in July and August of 1945.
The war in Europe is over at this point, but there's still a war on the other side of the world against the Empire of Japan. That war is going to be the topic of discussion right here in Potsdam. Joining us today is Mr. Matthias Simic, who is the curator of the museum here at Titilienhof. Mr. Simic, who took part in the Potsdam Conference?
Well, here at the conference hall, it was a meeting of the so-called Big Three, so the leaders of the major powers of the anti-Hitler coalition. And it was Generalissimus Stalin, the dictator in the Soviet Union, also the leader of the Communist Party. Then Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He was the leader and the strong man of Great Britain, United Kingdom during the war. And finally, Harry S. Truman, the President of the United States. And I could show you where they did take place. The flags indicate the places of the Big Three. On the left side, the big chairs there. This was Stalin's place. Opposite on the right, place of Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And just on the other side of the table, Harry S. Truman's place.
Wow, so it's a whole new set of leaders from earlier in the war. What are they talking about at Titilienhof?
Well, they tried to summarize, they tried to decide about the future, not only of Germany, but also of Europe and the whole world, you can say so. So they did talk about the so-called 4Ds regarding Germany. The 4Ds is an English abbreviation. The first D was the demilitarization of Germany. So no armed forces and fighting persons were allowed in the future for Germany. Then the denazification of Germany. And you know, a few months later, in November 1945, they started with the Nuremberg trial. The third D was the democratization of Germany. But as you know, they did not give a definition of democracy. So it was even for Stalin possible to sign the democratization of Germany because it was not defined. And finally, the decentralization of Germany. This meant in a political but also economical way. And economically speaking, there were big German enterprises like Krupp or others who supported the Nazi party and the war efforts of the Nazis during the war. They had to be split in smaller enterprises to reduce their influence and power. And in a political way, this was meant to divide Germany in several zones, not only the zones of occupations, you know, there were 4 zones of occupations, but also they gave Germany a federal system. And even until today, we are not a centralized state, we have a federal system with different states, like Berlin is even a city-state, like New York, Washington, D.C. in the United States.
So there was still a war going on in the Pacific against Japan. What was the conversation about Japan here?
Yeah, that's totally true. Of course, they discussed the war going on against Japan in the Pacific region. There were some meetings here of the chiefs of staff of the three tripartite powers, of the Americans, the British, and even the Soviet Union, to discuss the strategic decisions, for example. But very important is at the beginning of the Potsdam Conference, Harry S. Truman, he got a secret message from his war ministry with the information the baby is born, and this gave him the information that they had made a successful atomic bomb test in the West, in the desert of New Mexico in the United States. And from now on, the United States was in the possession of the very strong and powerful weapon of the atomic bomb to eventually use it against Japan to end the war. And there was even a session here. At the end of a session, Truman walked by and he passed by to Stalin and he gave him the information, well, I have information for you that we are now in the possession of a powerful weapon. And Stalin did not really reply in detail. He did say, okay, make good use of it against the war against Japan. And finally, they issued a telegram from Potsdam, the so-called Potsdam Declaration. On the 26th of July, it was issued to the Japanese government. And in this declaration, they asked for unconditional surrender of the Japanese.
Is it true that Stalin already knew about the bomb even before Truman shared the secret with him?
Well, at these times, nobody knew, but today we know that he already knew about it because he had some spies, some Soviet spies, communist spies. It was even a German communist, Klaus Fuchs, for example, and he gave the Soviet Union some detailed information about this.
Wow, thank you so much, Mr. Simic, for your time. I wonder what the Japanese government said in response to the Potsdam Declaration.
That's a great question, Katie. Let's toss it back to our team at the National World War II Museum to find out. But before we do, let's pose another poll question for our audience. What was the name of the top secret project that produced the atomic bomb? A, the Omaha Project, B, Project X, C, the Manhattan Project, or D, Operation Trinity? Our team back in New Orleans will have the answer for you.
Hey, Mrs. Perry and Katie. We're back in the National World War II Museum, this time in the Road to Tokyo exhibit to get a better understanding of the last few months of the war in the Pacific Theater. While our audience votes, let's answer Katie's question. There were debates within the Japanese government about whether they should seek a diplomatic solution to end the war, perhaps through the Soviet Union. But no decision has been made, and Stalin's agreement to end the war in the Potsdam Agreement had limited that option. So when a Japanese prime minister was asked about the Potsdam Declaration, he responded with a single word. It's a word that doesn't directly translate into English, but it can mean something like no comment or something more aggressive like unworthy of comment. A lot of the international press translated it as a statement of defiance, implying that Japan might never surrender. So at this point, we're on the road to the end of the war in the Pacific, but it's an end that will come at a huge human cost. But before we go further, let's answer the question for our audience. We asked you, what was the name of the top secret project that produced the atomic bomb? A, the Omaha Project, B, Project X, C, the Manhattan Project, or D, Operation Trinity? The answer is C, the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project will play a key role in the War of the Pacific.
To learn more about what's going on in the Pacific in 1945, we're here with Bradley again from the National World War II Museum. Bradley, we just heard about how the Allies are thinking about the war in the Pacific. Can you please catch us up on what's happening in the Pacific War in early 1945?
Absolutely. By early 1945, the US Army is able to actually bomb Japanese cities on a regular basis, and so the war is actually being taken to Japan itself. However, on April 1st, the US Army and Marine Corps invades the Japanese island of Okinawa. This will become one of the bloodiest battles of all of World War II in the Pacific. More than 12,000 Americans will lose their lives in 82 days of brutal fighting. More than 100,000 Japanese civilians and more than 90,000 Japanese soldiers will also die in this battle. And so after the Battle of Okinawa, American policymakers are thinking, how can this war end? Is it going to be necessary to lose a ton more lives on both sides of this conflict before it can come to an end?
What options to win the war are the Allies considering in 1945?
Well, the most obvious option would be invading mainland Japan itself. But Allied policymakers, including President Harry Truman, fear that this could cost as many as 1 million American lives and countless Japanese lives. And so the American government begins considering another option, using a top-secret weapon, the atomic bomb, that's actually been tested on July 16th in secrecy. And so now the American government's considering, should we use this top-secret weapon to end the war in a way that doesn't necessarily cost 1 million plus lives?
So, what did President Truman decide to do?
Well, let me show you. President Truman makes the decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities in an effort to end the war. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb is dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing 100,000 people instantly. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb is dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing fewer than 100,000 people because it drops in an industrial area, but still taking a terrible death toll on the civilian population. In the days to come, the Japanese emperor will have to decide whether to continue the war in the face of this horrendous civilian devastation.
And how did Japan respond to this?
So on August 14th, 5 days after that second atomic bomb was dropped, Emperor Hirohito decides that the war must end. He actually makes a recording announcing to the Japanese people that the war has to end and that Japan will be surrendering. There's actually a coup inside the imperial palace by some officers who want to fight on, even though the emperor has decided that the war should end. But they're actually defeated, and the following day the emperor's broadcast goes out to the Japanese people. The war is finally coming to an end. But in fact, it'll be a couple weeks later, on September 2nd, that the final official surrender is signed. A Japanese delegation meets with General Douglas MacArthur on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, actually signs the surrender, formally ending the war. So the war that's cost millions of civilian lives, hundreds of thousands of soldiers' lives on both sides of the conflict, is finally coming to an end.
Wow, I've learned so much. Thank you so much, Bradley, for your insight.
Anytime, Isabella, and please come back visit us again here at the National World War II Museum.
Of course. So the war is finally over. On the evening of September 1st, 1945, a day earlier due to the time difference with Japan, President Harry Truman addressed the U.S. by radio to declare the war officially over. Just hours earlier, Japan had signed the official surrender in Tokyo. In a moving moment, he told the American people,
"We think of those whom death in this war has hurt, taking from them fathers, husbands, sons, brothers and sisters whom they love. No victory can bring back the faces they long to see. Only the knowledge that the victory which these sacrifices have made possible will be wisely used can give them any comfort. It is our responsibility, ours the living, to see to it that this victory shall be a monument worthy of the dead who died to win it."
The war is finally over, but millions of people have died and the world has been changed forever. Now the Allies face a big question. What do you do now? How do you rebuild from the deadliest war of human history? How will people mourn, heal, and begin rebuilding their lives? And how will disagreements and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union shape the post-war world?
Join us in part 2 of World War II Legacy Electronic Field Trip to find out the answers to those questions and more. But for now, from Potsdam, Germany, and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, thanks for joining us on our journey together.